So, so the question that came up in this chat is, can someone explain basically how all this applies to the school project, and that this person is new to the issue? So, John, can you help to translate? And again, I don't expect you to take a personal position on the school, good or bad. But when people are hearing that this building is going to be built behind the Wheelock site, it's going to be built in a well protection district, it's going to be built in a, what do all the things that Andrew talked about? Can you translate what that means to that particular location?
Yeah, I can provide a little bit of translation for this. And I don't have any stake in this project. My son graduated from Medfield High School in 2010. He's long out of Wheelock School, but I have fond memories of going over there. So what we need to be careful of here, and with any construction project and any development project, is how do we manage the rainwater, the water that falls on the site? How does it get from falling out of the sky to the aquifer or to the Charles River? The Wheelock site is in the Charles River Valley. What are the things we need to think about? Well, water falling on the roof, water falling on solar panels, water falling on pavement. How do we manage that water? How do we get it into the ground rather than allowing it to run off where we lose it and it's no longer available to the aquifer? And also that water can pick up contaminants. And as Andrew mentioned, if you're constantly putting nitrogen, phosphorus fertilizer on a soccer field, if you're not very careful about the application of those fertilizers, some of that is leaching into your groundwater below. It's going into the aquifer and it's traveling to the well, because the well is like a straw. It's like a straw sucking water out of a glass. And so you have to very carefully manage these things in the process of design. And when I was on the Conservation Commission with Caroline, we used to ask for developers in town to say use cisterns from the runoff from the roof, so the water would be channeled locally on site into the ground, and so that it wouldn't run off into a catch basin and out into a stream right away. And with the parking lots, where you're salting them in the wintertime, there's more salt going on there than you need to melt the ice. And if you're using potassium chloride as a substitute, that's fine, but now you're adding potassium, and that's also a fertilizer. So you have to be very careful, and you don't want to starve the aquifer of water that it was already getting. This is part of urban sprawl, because the more that you keep making more rooftops and more parking lots and more roads and fewer trees, you're taking away from what you have left as your water supply. So it's very, you have to be very careful about doing that and make sure that everything is maintained in balance when you do that. Especially, if you start putting up, you think about these solar panels, they're not pervious, they're solid surfaces, they're impervious. So water that falls on them immediately goes onto the ground and runs off quickly. So those are some of the issues around water management and protection of the aquifer where you're building.
Okay, thanks. And for those of you, I just kind of skipped over, any kind of formal introduction of John Thompson, but for anyone who doesn't know John, John is a longtime Medfield resident. He's the president of Waypoint Environmental. He has over 25 years of experience in environmental consulting. He holds an undergraduate degree in geology from the University of Maine, a Master of Science degree in geology from the University of Rhode Island with a concentration in, got cut off, what was concentration in?
And my Master of Science is in glacial hydrogeology.
Okay.
So I studied aquifers just enjoyed being outside and learning about how the natural environment works as a system, but also how it can very quickly go out of balance.
Right. And for those of you that don't know, John is the chairman of the Medfield State Hospital Mediation Committee and the chairman of the Medfield State Hospital Environmental Review Committee. And honestly, if it wasn't for John and Bill Mazzaro, we would have contamination issues up there. It's been decades in terms of trying to just make sure that our Charles River is safe and our town is safe from environmental issues up there. So really the future generations of Medfield are certainly indebted to John for all of his hard work in Medfield.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, you're welcome. So what do you touched upon some of the things already, John, but are there any burning issues that you want to touch on with regard to, the Elm Street area, the wells in that area, Minebrook? Is there anything that jumps out at you that you think people really should want to know about as they sort of start to evaluate, the impact of a potential building on that site?
Well, I think that's just part of my biggest concern for the town of Medfield is overpopulation. Mm-hmm. Because most people, when they hear about climate change, you'll never hear a politician talk about overpopulation and connect it to climate change. But it's absolutely the reason for climate change, because more people need more energy and they need more of everything else. And so it's not sustainable. And at a local level, our town needs to watch very carefully the water supply, because it really is the first thing that will limit what we are able to do in the town in terms of our resources. If we overpopulate, the first thing that we will lose is our water supply. And I know from my own professional experience that going on MWRA water is not a good solution for the town. And maybe other people, don't mind paying the numbers that Andrew was talking about for their water, but once you let someone else have control of your resource, you're also at the control of their rate structure. And so unfortunately, we have to be careful about how we make variances to zoning, for instance, and how many houses and rooftops and parking lots and so forth we will allow in the town. Because as I said, the water supply is a finite number. It's a calculated number. Every person uses between 68 and 72 gallons per day, every single person. So if you multiply that number times the population of the town, you can figure out how many gallons our wells need to deliver to the town. And every time you add another 68 to 72 gallons, you're putting more stress on our water supply. I take the hospital, for instance. If we put 300 units of housing up there, we might add 600 people. Well, now you need to take that number 600 and multiply it times 70. That's how much water our wells will need to provide. And because it's a finite resource, it's not a bottomless pit. Each well has what's called a specific yield. And the specific yield is the number of gallons per day that the well can provide. And a lot of people don't know, in the summertime, 95% of the town's water comes out of well number 6 up along the Charles River. And that's because that well is completed right on the bank of the river. So it's literally pulling river water through the sand and gravel and supplying the town. It's very finite resource that you can't ignore.
Right. And I think one of the other questions that Tom Powers had alluded to, the rock salt or the road salt. And I think that there's sort of a two-part question with regard to stormwater management. In talking with two of our different watershed partners, one of the points that they made was that stormwater management, even the most sophisticated stormwater management, isn't 100% foolproof. Is that true? What's your reaction to that?
That's true, because everybody has everybody has put, salt in water. It's very water soluble. It dissolves in water readily. So it's very difficult to remove salt. You really can't, because by the time you put it on the snow, it's just going to sit there until the snow melts, and then it's available for spring rain to wash it away into the storm drains. And the best you can do is remove the solids like the sand and gravel, the sand that's put on roads, that binds with some of the salt, and you can catch it in a catch basin, which means you have to have active maintenance of all your catch basins, because all that sand in the bottom of the catch basin is picking up the road salt. So if you don't maintain your infrastructure, then you're setting yourself up to increase the sodium levels in your groundwater supply. And the state is very concerned about the sodium levels because it's connected to hypertension, high blood pressure. So anybody with high blood pressure should not be drinking groundwater from a well that has a high sodium content.
Right. So it seems like a lot of, it seems like in ideal circumstances, you can have bylaws, that prohibit salt use, or you can have bylaws that prohibit, other types of use of chemicals or whatever in certain districts. But who enforces it?
So there really is not much of an enforcement. The Mass Department of Environmental Protection is in an sort of an enforcement role, but more so in the role of providing what they call best management practices. Using alternative chemicals, using chemicals in the right amounts. Right now, the place where our water is tested is at the wastewater treatment plant. And so they probably take samples every month for a suite of chemicals, including sodium chloride, salt, and other chemicals. And Andrew mentioned other things like pharmaceuticals. This pharmaceuticals in all water, and even in water supplies, if I took a sample of the Charles River right now, I could find Motrin in that water. You can find all kinds of pharmaceuticals in the water that comes from the wastewater plant, and we don't even test for that. That's not even tested.
There are two questions, and I think what we'll do is after these two questions, we'll move on to Jeff Hyman. Jerry just gave me a heads up on the timing here, just so we can make sure we're sensitive to that. John, a few years ago, this is a question from Vicky Leah. A few years ago, I had 10 inspectors arrive at my house to test our water because the water at Wheelock School came back positive for bacteria. Our concern is, will the additional school affect our water quality? That's her question.
It can, and bacteria can be from other sources. It can be from the buildup of rust and so forth on the inside of old pipes underground. So if the water pipes are very old, and you can get some bacteria that grows in an environment that lacks oxygen, like underground on the inside of a pipe, that bacteria can be floated off and into the water pipe and end up in your faucet, coming out of your faucet. Another way, and some towns fight this, I know Sherborne has had a problem with nitrates from agricultural land with a lot of manure. The nitrates are very water soluble and they can get in water supplies. And another source of bacteria is if you had a lot of Canadian geese on a golf course, for instance, they're eating all those fertilizers, and then they're pooping on the golf course, on the grass, and then that's washing into the water. So there's some other sources. And so if you create a lot of big open grassy fields that birds are coming and sitting and eating grass and defecating on the field, and that also goes for anything, dogs and anything else on open space, that some of that will wash into the aquifer. And so they have to be careful about, again, following best management practices and maintenance. And sometimes if the pipes are creating a lot of bacterial problems, you can either add something to kill the bacteria, like hydrogen peroxide or sodium hydroxide, But it can be very difficult to control over time.
Okay, thank you. And then
Mhm.
the last question here is from Jeanette Rule, who wanted to know, do you know of any town or city in Massachusetts who does it right with regard to public water supply? If so, can we learn from them?
I think, I've done some work with some volunteer work for the town of Dover, and I think they do a very good job. They work closely with their Board of Health. Town of Dover is completely on groundwater and mostly private groundwater. So they need to be careful that they don't allow too many houses in the town extracting groundwater, because eventually somebody's going to buy a lot and put a water well in, and there's not going to be enough water to support a 4-bedroom house. So you just have to pay attention to it. And most towns that are solely on groundwater put an emphasis on understanding it's a finite resource and that its water quality properties need to be monitored closely.
Okay, thank you. Actually, Gil Rogers came in with another question. How does the cutting down of forests that is occurring all around town with new housing and other developments, for example, Route 27, affect the aquifer and future water supply?
Well, anytime you cut down trees, you reduce the amount of water that's being held back and available for groundwater supplies, because it just simply runs off faster. And you have coniferous trees, which are pine trees, and you have deciduous trees, which are leafy trees like Norway maples. And pine trees actually hold more water. When it rains, there's more water held up in a pine tree than there is in a maple tree, a tree with a leaf. And that's because of the surface area on a needle. It's like a brush getting wet. When you cut the trees down, that water is no longer dripping off the leaves over time and drying out. It's falling on the ground and it's running away. It's running off. And so you're subtracting more available water that would have naturally saturated the ground and potentially added to the water table.
Okay, thank you.